So we can move on to the Inquirer. You were there
Yeah.
for quite a long time, and
Mhm.
upper management in the newsroom.
Yes.
What what did you find when you got there?
Mhm.
When you became the managing editor, was there anything about the culture of the place you wanted
Mhm.
to change? And did you start to tighten up the ethics standards? Did
Yes.
they need tightening up?
Yes, Gene Roberts became the executive editor in October of 1972, and I was one of the first people he hired, and I came as managing editor in February of 1973, 4 months later. Gene took the job because it was a challenge. That this was not a very good newspaper, had not been under Walter Annenberg. It was only 2.5 years into the ownership by Night newspapers. And so we were dealing with the staff, most of whom we had inherited from the Annenberg era. And Annenberg had gone through several, or at least one major buyout, and so a lot of people who could have got jobs elsewhere took them. And when I'm saying this, I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. That there were some very good journalists that we inherited, but by and large, it was not the staff that we wanted to take the Inquirer to the level that we wanted to take it to, and the practices were not well developed, even though our ideas about journalism ethics were still evolving at that point. The Annenberg era, that Walter used the paper as a political weapon against his enemies, and he had several. He would not list their names in the paper. I think the president of the University of Pennsylvania could not have his name listed in the Inquirer, and all the reporters and copy editors knew that his name was not, he would become a spokesman for the University of Pennsylvania if it became necessary to quote him at all. The Philadelphia 76ers, they stopped running during the Annenberg era, stopped running the scores because they didn't like the 76ers or their owner. That's the sort of thing. And I think that they had a political reporter who would go after Walter's enemies. And one of them was Milton Shapp, who later became governor of the state. And the reporter was asked to ask at the press conference, Governor Shapp, have you ever been in a mental institution? And he said no. That was the end of the question and answer. But the headline the next morning on the front page of the Inquirer said, Shapp denies being in mental institution. So that's the sort of thing that highly manipulated. And of course the Joseph Carafin case, Joe Carafin was an investigative reporter during that era. He was exposed by Philadelphia Magazine in the late 60s as having extorted money from people on whom he had dug up dirt. That he would tell them, here's a story that's going to go in the Inquirer, but you can keep it out if you retain me as your public relations specialist for a certain amount of money per month. And after that story came out, Carafin went to prison for extortion. So this is the sort of reputation we were trying to live down, and presented quite a challenge for us. The Inquirer, underneath the nameplate on page 1, said oldest newspaper in America. And critics of the Inquirer would say that it starts with a lie and goes from there. That it was not the oldest newspaper, but that at one point Walter Annenberg had hired a genealogist to trace the history of the paper from its founding in 1829. It was the third oldest paper continuously published since 1829. That's quite a feat in itself, but he made it number 1 because they had over the years bought papers that were started earlier than 1829 and earlier than the Hartford Courant. So the paper started off with a slogan that was false, and it was on the front page every day. So that's what we were dealing with.
So can you think of other ethics issues that came up in the context of covering desegregation in Little Rock?
Well, one incident that came up, and this is toward the end of what I call the crisis in '59, when the moderates, that is white school board members who were willing to accept desegregation in order to keep the schools open and to have and have peace, and winning out over dead-end segregationists who closed the schools in '58, '59, and who were willing to do anything to avoid desegregation. So in the recall election, it was a showdown where all 6 of the board members, 3 moderates and 3 dead-end segregationists, had their tenure challenged, and the public, by a very narrow margin, voted for the moderates to stay in and the dead-end segregationists to be ousted. At that time, all they needed was 1 more member to get a majority. And in an act of generosity, they offered the defeated segregationists chance to, no questions asked, give the appointing person the name of someone to go on the school board, and that person will be a 6th member of the board. He'll be outvoted or she'll be outvoted 5-1, but will be on the board. The name they gave turned out to be that of a convicted burglar. And of course, our reporters, before the end of the day, were able to establish that he not only was a convicted burglar, but he was ineligible to serve because of this felony. And so the burglar came to see Harry Ashmore and said that it's a deal. I never was appointed. I'm willing to withdraw my name, and you don't need to report tomorrow. And Harry Ashmore, quite correctly, said that we don't manage the news. We only report the news. And you were appointed. You were found to be ineligible, and you have now withdrawn. We will report all of that. So I thought to myself, I think that's a good decision. But it's the sort of thing that I never studied in college. And because we did not have a course such as we have now in journalism ethics with case studies. And I said, well, maybe there ought to be something that we teach in college, editor's decisions or something like that, the kind of dilemmas, or maybe this wasn't a dilemma, but the kind of difficult decisions you might be presented with as a working journalist. And from all that, though, has evolved, I think, particularly in the last 25 years, the kind of courses we have around the country in universities now.
So when you think about things like avoiding conflicts of interest, that can often be fairly clear what's acceptable and what isn't. And certainly when you're talking about plagiarism and fabrication, those cases are really clear, what's acceptable and what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
But what about, when you get into some of the murkier areas like the use of anonymous sources
Mm-hmm.
and letting people go off the
Mm-hmm.
record, and how have the standards changed in those areas over time, and where do you think we are right now, and do they need to change some more, or does enforcement need to be tighter still?
Yes, I think that there's still anonymous sources, a very, very difficult area for us, and one that we did. I don't believe our business has got our arms around yet at all. I think that in an abstract, if you got a bunch of journalists together in a seminar, they would agree that they would say that, and they're correct in my opinion. There's some stories that are so important, and they can only be got by protecting your source, because these people are taking a chance and giving you the information, the whistleblowers. But I think that they might agree in such a seminar on the abstract that it ought to be very, very limited. But then when they get to writing stories, they start putting it in. And the Times has gone through some New York Times, interesting studies on that their policy is to highly restrict anonymous sources. And so they've tried to reduce that. And the AP, of course, has a policy. They had to explain why a person is going off the record or is anonymous. And I don't know if this, I personally don't think it works very much to say the person spoke on condition of anonymity because it has not been publicly announced. Well, that doesn't tell me a whole lot other than he's speaking out of turn. But that's the sort of thing we're still trying to figure out how to deal with that and to get the word out that we really mean it when we say don't use anonymous sources. Clark Hoyt, the public editor, got a class at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism to study the Times for 6 months before they announced their tightening up policy, and 6 months later, or 6 years later, or 6 months in a later period, and he did find that they reduced it, but they didn't come close to stamping it out. And Bill Keller, the editor, pointed out to staff, we still have a long way to go.
Does the public care about this?
I think that I don't know if they will write a letter to the editor about it. It'll rise to that level. But my theory, and I've felt this for a long time, is that all the surveys show that they tend not to trust us. I think that's misplaced, and I think they really do trust the papers and the stations that they listen to and watch and read daily. But they have this antipathy toward the news media, and I believe that given the fact that they tend to be cynical about what we do, we shouldn't ask them, this is important what we heard from this person. We can't tell you where we heard it, but trust us, we know that somebody actually told us. I think there's a lot of cynicism there that they don't really believe that. And it's like, well, they may not realize the point where they want to complain about it, but I do think it bothers them. So I think that it's a good thing to throttle back on anonymous sources, and we've been saying that for 30 years.
So where does this public antipathy toward journalism come from, and what can be done about it?
I'm not sure. My book discusses that, and there are some theories out there, and I guess I would go with Roy Peter Clark, who thinks that part of it is they're conditioned by bloggers who say the MSM, the mainstream media, are no good, by their being depicted on Law and Order and other dramas as being no good people. That I think subliminally all this rubs off. People, and I think they see examples of it perhaps on television, of a television reporter, asking a poor woman, "How do you feel now that your son is dead?" That they see things that bother them, and I think they blame. They'll see all of us the same way. It's not an uncommon thing, but I do think it's conditioning over a period of time.